So today, hey, welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to have Jörn with us. Jörn is a researcher at the University of Hohenheim, where Bernd is placed as well. And Jörn, I first interacted with him much like I did with Felix, who was our last input speaker at the Bayes Summer School up in Norway, which was a lot more scenic than what we're doing right now, given the circumstances. And Jörn has agreed to talk to us about hierarchical models today, which are a bit out of our reach with what we've learned so far, but I have absolutely no fears that he won't be able to get the point across to us as to how cool hierarchical models can be in Bayes. And with that, I'll just give the floor to you, Jörn, and take us away.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Thanks a lot for the introduction and for the, of course, for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to get at least an online opportunity to interact with EU people on an international level again. Because I still find it quite interesting to have Bernd around. I'm aware that he was connected to your study group, not sure whether he is at home or just sitting in the floor above me. Anyway, Eric and I discussed that I would talk a bit about hierarchical models in a Bayesian context and applications in ecology. If we would go into details of like reasonably complex hierarchical models that might indeed be a bit of a stretch. So what I decided to do to start with some very basic examples, go through them in a bit more detail. And then just briefly present some examples where I use hierarchical models in my work, without going into too much technical details, and then we can see in the discussion whether we want to dive into certain aspects in more detail. So if you can now see my presentation.
Yes, that looks really good.
Yeah, so as I said, I will talk a bit about principles of hierarchical models in the Bayesian context, or in short, hierarchical Bayes. That would be the main part of my presentation. Then I briefly talk about two applied examples, one looking at demographic analysis for demographic species distribution models, and one looking at combining observation models for integrating different types of species occurrence data. My starting point for introducing this idea and appeal of hierarchical models and using Bayesian methods is this paper by Jim Clark, already now 16 years old, from 2005, but I think it's still a very good primer into the topic, with this catchy people, why environmental scientists are becoming Bayesians, where he mainly makes a point that it might not be so much the philosophical appeal of the Bayesian approach that drives this increased application of Bayesian methods in environmental sciences and ecology that we have seen over the last, say, 20 years. Although, of course, there's quite some philosophical appeal to this Bayesian approach, and I guess you have discussed this quite a lot in based on the McAverts book you've been working through. So this idea of expressing our knowledge of parameters in terms of probability distribution, and then formulating our statistical analysis to improve our knowledge about these parameters in the face of new incoming data. Of course, that's all very appealing, and it avoids some of the more stranger aspects of frequentist methods. But in this paper, Jim Clark makes specifically this point that the main feature of this hierarchical approach is that it provides framework for more complex and higher dimensional models that are needed for statistical inference and prediction and ecology, and that the real power of hierarchical Bayes comes from this capacity to accommodate complexity. At this one, I just want to make a short note on terminology. So often we hear people talking about hierarchical Bayesian models, which is a bit of a confusion because the statistical model and that we formulate themselves is not Bayesian or frequentist. It's just a model, and then we choose to use a frequentistic approach or a likelihood-based approach or a Bayesian approach to make statistical inference based on this model. But because it's the use of Bayesian statistics and the use of hierarchical statistical models is so interconnected, we often speak of hierarchical Bayesian models or hierarchical Bayes as a shortcut. In short, so what are these hierarchical models? One way to phrase this in a non-technical way would be that's a quite intuitive way to develop more complex statistical models that then accommodate stochasticity and either variation or uncertainty at various levels, and build these models from quite simple building blocks. And we can do this to approach different modeling problems. So here's an overview of from this Clark paper, and where we compare the standard model or a simple Bayes model, and where we just look at the likelihood of our data given the parameters to different types of more complex models. And the first one would be where we include individual level effects that describe variation in the model parameters across, say, individuals or groups of individuals. And then as an additional modeling step, and describe also variation in these parameters themselves. And we can also apply this hierarchical modeling techniques to do something similar for our explanatory variables. So also describe, and by describing the true value of an explanatory variable, say some climate variable in our data set, not as a fixed known value, but as an unknown, and then describe and the true value of the environmental variable, and with a probability model conditional on our measurements for these covariates and possibly some more parameters. And something I will go into a bit more detail later would be the application of these hierarchical models for integrating information from different data sources and different types of data that are sampled in different ways according to different protocols, and therefore are not easily combined in a simple statistical model, and where we would have to make common assumptions about these different data types. But again, by hierarchical modeling techniques, I can combine the information from the different data sources in one model while accounting for differences in the data types. Of course, and these are quite simple examples of hierarchical models. One can push this quite a bit further. And here's one other example from a paper from Jim Clark, where they formulated a quite complex model to learn about tree demography and demographic processes in forest trees from a huge range of different types of data and representing a huge number of different processes in this one hierarchical statistical model. And this possibility to formulate this more complex statistical models that thereby also represent our actual knowledge about ecological processes. That's another big argument for the application of this Bayesian hierarchical models in ecology. Here I just want to point to this paper by Clark and Gelfand. I'm also already a few years older, which really see this possibility to marry the fields of ecological process modeling and statistical analysis in these integrated hierarchical models as an important part of the future for models and data in the environmental sciences. So that's a broad overview of the potentials of this hierarchical model linked techniques, and I want to narrow down and come to a more technical definition of what these hierarchical models are. So the basic idea here is that instead of looking at a simple model that only consists of one likelihood function that we can formulate, which together with the prior then gives us our posterior distribution for our parameters, we expand this by including additional building blocks in our model, and the technical term would be the factorization of the posterior into a sequence of different probability models. So if we're looking at a more complex problem where we have two sets of parameters, here θ1 and θ2, it might be difficult to formulate one closed likelihood function for our data given these two types of parameters, but we might be able to break this down into two probability models. So the first describing the likelihood of our data given some parameters θ2, and then we might have a second model that describes the probability of certain values for these parameters and θ2 given another set of parameters θ1, and then based on standard probability calculus, we can then describe the joint probability of all our parameters given the data as the probability of our data conditional on parameters θ1 times the probability of parameters θ1 given the parameters and θ2 given the parameters θ1 times our prior knowledge for these parameters θ1. And I want just to explain this step of increasing the complexity and ending up with an hierarchical model with a quite basic example, which I hope links quite nicely to the topic of generalized linear models, which you looked at, I guess, in your previous sessions. And I want to look at a simple example for generalized linear regression of lizard abundance, where we assume we have count data for the abundance of a certain lizard species on 200 different sites that vary in their vegetation cover, and we want to understand how vegetation cover affects the abundance of this lizard species. This example is a slightly modified version of an example from the book Introduction to Windbugs for Ecologists by Mark Carey. And as all the examples in this book, also here for now we're working with simulated data just to keep everything clear and simple. And so down here you see a simulated data set showing the variation in the count data for this lizard on different sites with different vegetation cover indices. And a simple approach to model this data would be to formulate a generalized linear model that uses Poisson error distribution, so standard choice when we look at count data, because the Poisson distribution describes non-negative penetrable values, and that's of course how our count data looks like. And then such a generalized linear model breaks down in basically two parts. And so one is the probability distribution we use to calculate our likelihood, or in a regression context, and that's often called the error model. So we assume that our observed lizard abundance can be described by a Poisson distribution with the parameter lambda, so the mean parameter for this Poisson distribution that is not the same on each sampling location, but might vary according to the vegetation cover. And then we have our regression equation that describes how the expected lizard abundance is described as a function of the vegetation cover. So there is a simple quadratic model. And then as many generalized models, we traditionally have this link function, and that we use to bring this linear predictor that can be any negative or positive number to the scale of our model parameter lambda, which as a mean for a Poisson distribution by definition has to be positive value. And so entering this log link, we ensure that whatever our linear regression equation predicts and will be transformed into a positive prediction for the expected lizard abundance. I guess you've also already seen and looked at this so-called directed acyclic graphs, or DAGs, to represent statistical models, where one typically makes this distinction between probabilistic nodes and deterministic nodes. And so the representation of this simple Poisson regression model would look like this: that we have our observations as a random variable, and depending on the predicted mean abundance. But this mean abundance, that's a deterministic function of our model parameters. That's why here I'm showing this as a m-square box for deterministic nodes. And in particular, when we come to more complex models, these so this deterministic functions, since they are not so relevant, they are often just skipped, and they only depict the stochastic nodes and the and as links between the stochastics and nodes my probabilistic models. So in the end, since this so everything that's happening here are just deterministic calculations, what this gives me is the probability of a certain value for an abundance count, conditional on my model parameters. So for each combination of parameters, and of course the values of the covariate x, which I also skip here, I can, according to this model, calculate the probability to observe a certain lizard abundance at a certain site. And then when I want to actually implement this model, I can do this, for example, in bugs or in JAX using the this bugs syntax. And since Eric said me you've been working with this Spinbugs book by Macari, I assume you've also seen some model examples in the bugs language already. And we write the model code for this simple Poisson regression. It resembles very much this mathematical model description I showed before. So for each data point, we describe our observation, and it's coming from a Poisson distribution and with a certain mean parameter lambda. Then we have here as a separate step our log link function. So it's not a log link, of course, it's a log link function, and where we say that and describe this variable mu as the log of the mean parameter lambda, and then we have our linear model equation, and finally the prior distribution for the three involved parameters. If I then do some MCMC sampling to get samples from the posterior distribution for my parameters, and this gives me the so-called drawing posterior distribution. So this MCMC sample does not only inform me about the posterior distribution of each individual parameters, and also can potentially show me correlations between different parameters. Because it's a sample from this multi-dimensional drawing posterior distribution, which in my case with the three model parameters is a three-dimensional distribution. Of course, I can then also condense this down into the so-called marginal posterior distribution by just looking at the frequency distribution of the samples for each parameter individually. And here I just would like to highlight that this is, of course, a quite nice and special feature of this Markov tree Monte Carlo approaches. And because it's so easy to get from this representation of the drawing posterior distribution to these marginal posterior distributions of the different parameters, and that would be much harder if I would solve these models in an for example, analytical framework. Then I might, for simpler cases, come up with a mathematical expression describing this drawing posterior distribution. But then from that, coming to marginal distributions for certain parameters might be a quite complicated extra step, and that of course becomes much more complex when I look at more complex models. And so this ability to get from this MCMC samples both the drawing posterior distribution, if I'm interested in it, but also this marginal posterior distributions is quite important. Then once I have this posterior distribution for my parameters, the next check or next step would be model checking, and therefore, like one important intermediate step is the generation of the so-called posterior predictive distribution. So probability distribution that describes for each of my observations how likely it is, and how probable this observation would be under my model. And to get this, I can also quite easily process from my MCMC sample, but just for each joint posterior sample, basically for each row in my MCMC output, calculate the expected abundance for all of my observations, and then just for each posterior sample, draw from a Poisson distribution with these and with this calculated mean parameter, and that then gives me for each observation a sample from the predictive posterior, which I in this case have depicted here. So across all observations as the median of the predictive posterior distribution for this for these observations, and the 95% credibility interval. So the two thin blue lines are the 2.5% quantile and the 97.5% quantile of the sample from this predictive posterior distribution. And then I guess you discussed in quite detail this idea of residual checks based on this posterior predictive distribution with Florian Hartig a few weeks ago. Where the main idea is that if our model would adequately describe the variation in our data, and we would expect that this predictive posterior distributions evenly cover our observations. And one way to quantify this is to look for each of our actual observations, where within this predictive posterior distribution my actual observation lies, and more specifically at which quantile my observation lies. So if my observation exactly hits the median of the corresponding predictive posterior, my observation would be at the 50% quantile. If it lies on this line, it would be at the 97.5% quantile, and my data points outside my credibility interval, they are at more extreme quantiles of this distribution. And if my model were correctly describing the variation in the data, I would expect that also 95% of my data lie within this 95% credibility interval, or more specifically that if I calculate these quantiles within the predicted posterior distribution for each data point, they should be evenly distributed. So I should get the same amount of data points in the, say, lower 10% of my of these predicted posterior distributions, as I would expect in the upper 90%, and also for the intermediate quantiles of this distribution. And if I do this for this model, I see that this is clearly not the case. So, and here we have much more of our observations lying in the extremes of the predictive posterior than we would expect if our model would describe the variation in the data adequately. And I can also depict this in form of this Q2 plots, which are often also shown for regression models in a more frequentist framework, and where then see this deviation as a deviation of these Q2 plot from this diagonal, or here just basically another way of showing the distribution of my quantile residuals now for different predicted values, which also shows me that in general, across the range of different predicted values, I always get more observations in the extremes of this predicted posterior distribution. Okay, so apparently my model in this case does not really adequately describe the variation in my data. And for this generalized linear models, that's typically a sign of so-called over-dispersion. And that's due to the fact that in many of these error models that we use for GLMs, for example, the Poisson distribution or the binomial distribution, we don't have this separate parameter that independently describes the variation of our data around the regression line. So whereas for a normal linear regression model, we always also estimate the standard deviation of our normal error distribution to accommodate for more or less variation of our data across the regression line. We don't have this possibility in the standard GLM using a Poisson distribution or a binomial distribution. That's why we often find that the actual variance is in our data is larger than predicted by this simple GLM we are using. And that, of course, means that one central assumption of our model is violated. There are basically two ways to deal with this. So one would be to choose another error distribution that allows us to adjust the variance. So that could be a negative binomial instead of the Poisson distribution, or so-called beta binomial instead of the binomial distribution. Don't want to go into any more empty detail there. Another possibility is to account for this additional unexplained variation in our data by adding an additional error term to our model. Or in other words, an individual level random effect that describes that my linear model equation does not directly describe the expected lizard abundance at a certain site with a certain vegetation cover, but that there is additional variation around this prediction. And so if I include this in my model, so all I'm doing is adding one more term to my regression equation. And so that will now be this individual level random effect. And I describe this random effect as coming from a normal distribution that describes variation across all my observations. And the important effect this has on my statistical model is that now this predicted mean abundance for each of my data points is not longer a deterministic function of my model parameters, but it becomes a stochastic node in my model itself, because it's now described as a random variable conditional on the regression parameters that describe the most expected or the generally expected mean abundance, but also depends on this variation in the individual level random effects. That means by including this individual level random effect, I basically moved from a simple Bayesian model that describes and that consists of a single probability model for the likelihood of my data given my model parameters to an hierarchical model that now breaks this down in 2 steps. So it describes the probability of my observations given a certain mean abundance for these and for this site, but then this mean abundance itself is a random variable conditional on the on my model parameters, but not fully determined by my regression parameters as before. And so I thereby am done this factorization of the posterior that I explained before. I'm now breaking down the joint posterior distribution of all the unknowns in my model, now including the mean abundance of each site into these 2 probability models, one for the likelihood of my data given lambda, and one for the probability of a certain value lambda for certain observations, and for a certain observation given my regression parameter, and this is additional variance parameter, and describing the amount of variation across my individual observations, or the amount of this individual level random effect. Again, the technical implementation of this slightly more complex model is still very straightforward. So I simply add this error term to my linear regression equation, and for each observation describe this as coming from a normal distribution with a certain precision in this case. So note that here in this Bugs code I describe the variance not by the standard deviation but by this precision parameter, which is the inverse of the variance. And then I just have to add also prior distribution for this one new model parameters and parameter. When I then look at the outcome of this, or of the outcome of Markov tree Monte Carlo sampling from the full joint posterior distribution of this model, I have to be aware that in principle this now also include a posterior distribution for all these values lambda for each observation, because they are now also unknown in my models. So if I were to depict the full joint posterior distribution, I would include also the samples for the values of lambda for all of my 200 observations. I've only shown the first here in this plot. But if I'm not interested in these lambda values, but only at my underlying model parameters, in the same way as before, I can just get these marginal posterior distributions by just looking at the sample for each parameter individually. So at this, from now on, having included this additional hierarchical level and the uncertainty about the actual values of the expected abundance on each study site does not really complicate the analysis of my posterior distributions for the parameters, because it's so easy to get these marginal distributions from my MCMC samples. So if I now proceed to calculate posterior predictive distributions from my joint posterior distribution, this in principle works the same way as before, but I have this one additional step that now when making these predictions, I again have to sample for each observation and values from this and for this individual level random effects. And thereby I incorporate this additional stochasticity or uncertainty, and when I make predictions from the model, and thereby these posterior predictive distributions become much wider, and thereby also include more of my observations within the, for example, the 95% credibility interval. If I now look at the distribution of the quantile residuals to make my residual checks, I see that this now looks much better. It's much closer to an even distribution. It's still not perfect, so this and so this test statistic from the QQ plot still detects a significant deviation from the expected one-to-one line, but at least it looks quite a bit better than before. There are still ways to improve this model. And one thing you might recognize if you look at this, now these credibility intervals from this model with overdispersion is that it seems to now more adequately include these small values within the predicted posterior, but these upper credibility intervals they became very large and maybe larger than necessary. That in our residual plot we also see by this belly here for intermediate quantile residuals, and which shows by that by including this general overdispersion term, we kind of like over-adjusted our variance, at least for part of the data. And here a solution would be to try to more specifically account for certain types of overdispersion, and in terms of or in case of such count data, very typical kind of overdispersion is so-called zero inflation, which means that in our data we see more observations of the total absence of the lizard than we would expect according to a Poisson regression model that describes variation only by a Poisson distribution, and which of course can describe the occurrence of a value of zero for a certain or assigns us like a positive probability to have an observation of zero at a certain study site. But often we find more zeros in our data than we would expect only according to the variation from a Poisson distribution. And in this case, the solution would be to separately the occurrence of zeros in our data separately from the regression model. And so we can extend our model by including an indicator variable I that describes just whether or not the lizard occurs on a certain site at all. And then for this indicator variable describes variation across sites by a simple binomial model with a certain probability MP. So and we extend our model by this separate processor describing just overall occupancy. It describes this by a certain probability that the site is occupied at all, irrespective of vegetation cover. And that allows us to better describe this occurrence of zeros in our data set, and without the need to assume such a general large amount of overdispersion. And just to wrap this up, so here we still see that this does not describe our data perfectly, and so as a further step, we can add a bit more complexity by not assuming a constant occurrence probability across all our sites, but again make this occurrence probability a function of vegetation cover. And then by describing here in green the occurrence probability as a function of the vegetation cover, and then in addition describing the distribution of abundance values, given that the species is present at all, and by our Poisson regression model, we finally achieve a quite satisfying, pretty even distribution of this quantile residuals, and can be more assured that our model adequately describes our data. Yeah, so for this last examples of this zero inflation model and the occupancy model, I did not include all the technical details, but yeah, I hope that already in the first step I could show you that adding such an extra hierarchical model, step in our model on a technical level is often not such a big deal. I just include one more variable in my model and describe the variation in this variable by one more probability model. That's also the key to many of these different types of hierarchical models. So what we have looked at in our example for this and for modeling lizard abundance as a function of vegetation cover was basically an example of individual level random effects. And I've now also prepared 2 more examples for my work where we look at one example is kind of in between these two, so where we look at the use of latent variables to combine different kinds of demographic measurements, and then finally I'll also show one example on integrating different types of occurrence records to understand distributions and changes in distributions of species. But maybe at this point it makes sense to ask for questions, whether there are some at this point.
Yes, if you wouldn't mind, a very potentially naive question to slide 21. which is where you presented the first update to our credible intervals.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that these intervals have, we probably over adjusted for our over dispersion here by having that upper bound of the 95% credibility interval just shoot up completely.
Mm.
I'm not saying this would have been a better solution, because I'm pretty sure it isn't, but could we have constrained that credibility interval a bit more with a more constrained prior on the tau variable?
Yes, I mean, you could have put an informative prior on this parameter.
I think it's shooting up because like 0 is infinitely far away in the log space of the link function, and therefore in order to go down to 0, it has to go up to infinity, and that's why it doesn't shoot up when he accounts for 0 inflation.
Yeah, so I mean, that doesn't have to go to infinity, because so with this Poisson error distribution, I mean, if we get a small value of lambda, say with a lambda of 0.5, we already get a very high probability for a 0 according to the Poisson distribution. So it doesn't have to go all the way to infinity, but indeed to make these many observed zeros likely according to our model, and we have to and we still have to like allow for a larger amount of this individual level variation, to also for intermediate values of the vegetation cover explain these current zeros. But we wouldn't need this much variance to capture our positive outliers.
Right. Thank you very much.
I have one very simple question. Like all of your priors is like 0 and then 0, 0, 0, 1. Is that not a very strong prior if the second thing is sigma?
Yeah, so that's a so that's because in this bugs syntax, or in the software packages that use this bug syntax, so WinBugs and MGX, the standard definition of a normal distribution does not use the mean parameter and the variance.
It uses precision, so it's the opposite. So it's very broad.
But it's a precision, exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Hmm.
Well, have you like? Yeah, go ahead.
Just to quickly add on to that, for anyone who's interested in getting to terms with JAGs and WinBugs, the material that Jörn has mentioned here is also up in our drive. So if you want to read up more on these specifications, it's all available.
Okay, so that's our material from the base course. You uploaded there.
No, I uploaded the book, Introduction to WinBugs, not your material from the course. No, that's yours. I'm not sharing that.
No, okay. Fair. I mean, I also wouldn't mind to give you the code for the specific examples. So there.
If you wouldn't mind, I think that would be a fantastic just resource to have for people to step into. Yes.
Yeah.
Like, so I know this lecture is about hierarchical models, and I actually think it's very impressive that you can deal with over dispersion by hierarchies instead of by hacking the likelihood, which is my preferred approach. But like, if you had gone with a negative binomial, like a 0 inflated negative binomial, and then had like a non-hierarchical model, do you think it would have been done better or worse?
I haven't tried this, and I mean this. In general, so what you get from a negative binomial is very similar to this Poisson log normal model. So this model I've presented here is in the literature often just refer to the Poisson log normal model, where you describe the relation in your data by a Poisson distribution with a lambda parameter that varies according to a log normal distribution. And they are indeed very similar. So, or to give a bit more technical details, so what the negative binomial distribution is equivalent to is a Poisson distribution where the lambda parameter varies according to a gamma distribution. And so I'm not sure whether you're familiar with the gamma distribution. So that's a probability distribution for describing continuous non-negative values. So, and similar as a log normal distribution, they can take very similar shapes. So yeah, I mean you can try both and compare them based on model compare on model selection criteria, but in many cases you find that they are not very different.
If I may make a suggestion here, if you end up giving us the code for this example, Jan, if you just want to run the same model just with a negative binomial distribution, then I'd be more than happy for you to show us your results whenever you've got those, and I can then link them back to Jörn.
Yeah, that would be fun.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. Last question. Since like x2 was just x squared, right?
X2, yeah, I think it was x2 in my, it's x2 in the mathematical model descriptions on it's x squared, yeah.
Yeah, and that's why you have multiple linearity in your beta regression coefficient, right? So have you considered actually, instead of having a prior and beta 1 and a prior and beta 2, actually having a multivariate normal on these two? Because like obviously if beta 1 increases, then beta 2 has to decrease, because the sum of those two is what gets pushed to the link function. So they could you could pool information across those two predictors.
Yeah, although I mean so I think I'm using a multivariate normal prior without specifying any covariance, I wouldn't make a big difference.
Well, not like so yes, you would obviously use like a LKJ prior or something, right?
Pardon, I didn't really got the last bit.
Yeah, I'm not an expert at multivariate normal, but you usually use like an LKJ prior, or you use the Wishart, right?
Yeah, so you then would use a Wishart prior for the covariance structure of the multivariate normal.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because I would know a priori they're correlated. I wouldn't know how much they're correlated, but like they're definitely correlated.
Yeah, but I mean, I can also learn about this this posterior correlation by looking at my just my posterior samples.
Yeah, but like if the two posteriors, if those were multivariate normal instead of like their own little normal thing, don't you think you would get more power? Or there's something I'm not getting here?
So maybe I'm also not getting the point of the question, but I would say that by using this independent normal priors for the different model parameters, I don't make any like a priori assumptions about possible correlations of these parameters, but still these correlations are then find in the joint posterior. They basically just reflect what I can learn from my data. So based on my data, I get this I basically learned that it could either be that so that I might either have a small beta 1 and a rather high beta 1, or the other way around. And I think that now, perfectly reflects what I can learn about these parameters from my data.
To be honest, I would have made the exact same model as you. It's just really smart people often use these multivariate normal to actually like gain extra stuff from this this correlation between the predictor values. It's kind of like if they're 50% correlated, then like in hand wavy math, then you get like half a time extra samples to predict the other one because of the correlation. But if you disagree, then you're probably right, because I know very little about the multivariate normal.
Okay, yes, I have actually big problems like understanding you both acoustically and getting the point.
If I may,
yeah,
I think I get where the confusion is coming from. If you could go back to your bugs code. I think the reason the multivariate normal came up here is because in this specification, you have beta 1 targeting x and then beta 2 targeting x squared. And the reasoning behind the question of potentially, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jan, if I misunderstand your question, but I think the reasoning here is that because x will always be very similar to x squared because they evolve in the same direction, they are collinear. The question was, why not introduce a shared prior for beta 1 and beta 2 at the same time?
Yeah, kind of exactly. Like if you know if x2 if x squared is the good predictor, then necessarily x not squared, the regression coefficient from that one is a bad predictor. So if one of them is high, the other one naturally should be low, because the product of them is what pushes you to your y, right? So you know the product of beta 1 and beta 2 with the squared taken into account should give some number. So therefore you know if one is high, the other one is low. So therefore, if you have some correlation parameter, then you could capture this information and therefore get like tighter bounds on these two parameters. But I'm not completely sure that's correct.
Yeah, I mean yes, I would say okay, you could yeah. So if you don't want to so if you don't want your prior to constrain these parameters, and so if I choose very wide normal distributions, then formulating this as a multivariate normal distribution for these two parameters together, that then also shouldn't affect my posterior distributions. So what I could do is to formulate a more constraining multivariate normal prior to yeah, to better deal with this problem of collinearity. I mean, as I would still say that in this case, I mean, I haven't looked at the correlation between these posteriors, but it's in this case it's not really a severe problem, because when I mean, in this case I had standardized my explanatory variables, so they have so my concentration there is a mean of 0, and then if I take the square of this, I mean, of course they are not independent, but there's not a strong linear correlation between the two, and between x and x squared. And so, I mean, in this case, I might get some correlation in the posterior, but I'm still perfectly able to identify both parameters.
No, I agree. Like most of your uncertainty doesn't come from the fact that you're uncertain about the regression coefficient on beta 1 and beta 2, right? And that is what a multivariate normal would help you on. Right? So I technically agree. So I think it's more an academic point than a like a real asset to your model.
To me, this sounds, without wanting to cut this short, to me sounds like there is agreement at this point, even though there might be a bit of confusion of the underlying terminology. And if Jan, if you don't mind, I think we're ready to move on.
Yes, indeed.
Oh, sorry. I also have a couple of questions, but luckily I wasn't diving as deep as Jörn and Jan into the topic, because I would have drowned. So my questions are like more easy. So the priors in the bugs, I was also wondering, so these are flat priors, even if they look like very precise. That's just because the second term is opposite to what we are used from the McAreth book somehow. So these are flat priors. Those are not informative.
Yeah, so it's normal distribution with a mean of 0 and then a variance of 1000.
Okay, cool. And the second question is like, why do we have like a x square? Like in the formula you're giving, I think a slide before, it's just x2, and in this linear prediction in the model, it's an x square.
Yeah.
Why is it quadratic? Just because you've seen the data pattern, or?
Yeah, so to be honest, that's a bit of just an inconsistency in my model time description. So here, x2 is actually meant to be the square of x1.
Ah, okay. So it's rather a typo than just anything.
Yeah, or I actually had changed this here because, yeah, so what I would, so when I implement this model in bugs, what I would also do is to first in my dataset calculate the variable x2 as the square of x1. And then here in this model code, I would also write this different variables x1 and x2 instead of doing this this calculation of x2 as the square of x1 within my bugs model.
Okay. Yeah.
But then I've thought here for explaining what's going on, it's easier to have only one variable and calculating the square.
Okay, I see. And
so so if you want to include a quadratic effect, you have these two options. Either you have only your explanatory variable x itself in your data set, and then in your model and description you include x and calculate the square of x, or beforehand you calculate a separate explanatory variable as x squared and call it x2 and include x2 in your box model.
Okay, I see. Yeah.
And I would say the second option is more or recommended one.
Again, that one very last question have. So the first trick you are doing here by adding these error term, that's what like in a frequentist approach linear model always is included, like these the noise around what we have.
I mean, that's so that's included if you do the normal linear regression model. So
yeah,
and with a normal error model, but it's not included if you do a GLM like this and a GLM in R, and they also cannot easily account for this over dispersion.
Okay, thanks. I will come down if I have any more questions and stuff.
Can meet on the balcony.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Any further questions? Yeah, if that's not the case, I would move on to my other examples. There, I just want to give you a few examples of where we used these hierarchical modeling methods in our ecological studies. And here I try to more focus on the general idea and so what were the problems that had to be solved with these approaches rather than going into too much into the technical details. And the first example I want to talk about is a study where we use basically tried to develop so-called demographic species distribution models, where we describe the distribution of species not by models fitted to the occurrence data of species and by parameterizing relationships between environmental covariates and the occurrence probability, but where we try to understand the ecological niche of species from the response of demographic rates to environmental gradients, and they will be able to quantify the niches of species independent from the occurrence data, and they will also be able to understand mismatches between niches and geographic ranges of species. And do this for our favorite model organisms, proteaceae shrubs in South Africa. So these are shrubs that occur in the Mediterranean type fynbos biome in South Africa. Dry shrublands that are very prone to recurring fires. And these species also have a very specific fire-adapted life history that makes them also a good model organism for these studies, because it facilitates the collection of demographic data that is then also informative for long-term population growth, and therefore for the quantification of ecological niches for these species. Specifically, they have a so-called serotinous life cycle, which means that these shrubs do not shed the seeds that they produce each year directly, but they keep them in fireproof cones. And then only after a fire occurred, the seeds are released from the cones, disperse, and germinate. And the idea behind the strategy is simply that when that after a fire, when all the above ground biomass is burned, the chance of these seedlings to establish successfully is higher than in a established community. And for most species, and when a fire occurs, the existing adults are also killed, which means they can only move on to the next generation through their seeds. But there are some species, so-called sprouters, that have fire-protected meristems at the rootstock, from which they can resprout after fire. And the advantage of this sorceress life cycle for demographic studies is that it can learn a lot about the demographic rates of these species in different environments from single visits to the populations. So when maybe I start with quantity data. So if I go to a plant community as a certain of a certain age, so a certain time after the last fire, and I count the cones that a certain shrub has, and then also count how many viable seeds there are in each cone. I can directly calculate how much this individual could contribute to the next generation if there were a fire at this age of the community. That's of course the big difference to studies of, say, trees in like in typical European forest, where for getting an estimate of this lifetime fecundity, I would have to observe the seed reproduction of a tree throughout its life, which is quite hard, and similarly then for the recruitment, since all the recruitment basically takes place just after fire. If I go to recently burned sites where the seedlings have just emerged, I typically can still recognize the burned adults, so you can still see the skeletons, and with some experience also determine the species of each burned shrub. So I know how many adults there were before the fire, and I can count how many recruits there are after the fire, and from this recruit to parent ratio, I already get a very good idea of population growth, and or at least how much reproduction contributes to population growth. And again, importantly, I can get this information by just going to the site once after the fire. I don't have to monitor the population across many years. And these different data types were collected for a total of 26 species across environmental gradients by a previous PhD student of us, Martina Treuernich, where quite an enormous field campaign. She collected this data for around 3,000 populations in total, and on study sites across the geographic ranges of all these species that varied in different environmental variables. And here I've listed the variables that I assume people to be most relevant for the for variation in demographic rates for the species. So winter temperature, summer temperature, measure of the summer aridity, soil fertility and also the length of the fire return intervals that also varies geographically. Then, as I explained before, on older sites, so that haven't burned for some time and are basically up for the next fire, we collected data on the fecundity, and on recently burned sites, and recorded this recruit to parent ratio, and also recorded data on the fire survival. And then in our statistical analysis, and we wanted to use this data to understand how main demographic rates respond to environmental variation or to gradients in environmental conditions. And here the rates we're interested in are first the fecundity, then the seed establishment rate, so the chance per seed to become a successful recruit, and finally the adult fire survival rate. And the problem we here face is that while from this data from older sites we get a quite nice direct estimate of fecundity, the data from this recently burned sites, so basically this ratio of pre-fire parents and post-fire recruits, they are the outcome of both fecundity and seed establishment rate. So this ratio between pre-fire adults and post-fire recruits, that depends both on how many seeds the adults had produced before the fire, and then how successfully these seeds established after the fire. And since the idea of this, or the basic approach of the study was to get this data by single visits to each population, for those sites that we visited just after fire, we don't know how many seeds the adults had produced before the fire. And so to analyze this data with respect to learning about seed establishment rate, we had to combine information from both these older sites and the recently burned sites, and to basically use what we learn about variation in fecundity across environmental gradients from this direct fecundity data set to predict as a latent variable the expected number of seeds that the adults that we saw as burned skeletons on this burned sites had produced before the fire. So we included this as a latent variable in our model. And so for each of these recently burned sites, we had this latent unknown variable describing the number of seeds that were produced before the fire, and that was informed by parameters that are also linked to this direct fecundity observations. And there we achieved two things. So basically, we could inform our estimate of fecundity also to some extent from this recorded recruit to parent ratios, because they of course also contain some information on so whether or not there were any seeds available from the pre-fire generation, but more importantly, we could describe the probable number of seeds that were available to produce the observed number of recruits and thereby estimate the per seat establishment rate. While automatically also taking into account all the uncertainty attached to this prediction of pre-fire fecundity, because modeling this as a random variable, of course, includes all the uncertainty about possible pre-fire fecundities. And here, adequately describing overdispersion in our fecundity is of course also crucial to adequately describe uncertainty about this latent variable. So in our fecundity submodel, which since we're looking at the number of counted seeds, is again based on a Poisson distribution. We found that we had to include a term describing overdispersion, so larger variance in the observed fecundity than we would expect just from a Poisson model, and this, of course, had also to be included in our predictions of this latent variable for the pre-fire fecundity on the recently burned sites, to be not confident in the estimation of seed establishment rates from these observations. So this complete flow of information across different model paths is also very appealing aspect of these hierarchical models. When we then looked at our model predictions, we again were not really interested in say these latent variables for the predicted fecundity for our specific study sites, but more in the general predictions for variation in our demographic rates across these environmental gradients, and so that's what I've depicted here in the first 3 rows. Again, it's a predictive posterior distribution where the blue line is the median. Then I guess in blue we have a 50% credibility interval, and then in gray and 95% credibility interval. And you see that in some cases these are quite wide. Because they include all this uncertainty from this different sources, including uncertainty about the pre-fire fecundity of these burned sites. But nonetheless, so predictions of variation in these 3 key demographic rates then allowed us to also make predictions of change in the intrinsic population growth rate across environmental gradients. And from this we then could, by combining these predictions for different demographic rates, and describe the ecological niches of species by identifying the set of environmental conditions where we predict a positive population growth rate, map this variation in population growth rates into a geographic space, and there compare it to the actual geographic distribution of the species and see to what extent these species actually occur, where we would predict them to be able to persist due to a positive population growth rate, and how large these mismatches are between the niches of species and their geographic distribution.
I ask a quick question, Jörn. Why is survival completely independent on anything like minimum temperature, maximum temperature, aridity, soil fertility. It's like survival is always constant, so they don't care about environment at all. It's just about getting there. Or
yeah, so that's why that's because in this case I look at one specific species, Protea longifolia, and that is one of these non-sprouters which are basically always killed by a fire, and that's why these fire survival rates are very low. And actually, for these non-sprouters, we decided not to model variation in response to environmental gradients, because because these rates are generally very low, and we, from looking at our data, we couldn't find any reasonable variation in the survival rate. So in basically 99 of 100 cases, and these species are dead after fire.
it makes sense, yeah.
But that looks different for the resprouting species. And there we also described environmental effects on the survival rate.
Is this also published from the resprouting ones?
Yeah, so they're included in the study. Yeah, so here I'm only showing the results for this one species, but in this paper, in PNAS, we have done this analysis for the 26 study species, including, I think 1/3 of them are resprouters and 2/3 are non-sprouters.
Cool, I will look it up.
Yeah, I mean, so in this paper, we then also looked at whether we can describe these different mismatches between ecological niches and geographical ranges by traits of the species, in particular their dispersal ability. But at this point, I don't want to go into the details of the studies. If that's something you're interested in, you can look up the paper. So here as a take-home message, I would say that here the key point from the perspective of statistical modeling was really that to combine these two different types of demographic observations, and to from that learn about environmental effects on this distinct demographic rates. And we had to analyze them jointly and use what we learned about variation in fecundity for the analysis of this recruit-parent ratios, and to understand environmental effects on seed establishment rates, and that required such a hierarchical model and with this latent state variable for the fecundity on the for the unobserved fecundity on the recently burned sites where we collected the recruit-parent ratios. And then I promise to also say a bit about these observation models for integrating different kinds of occurrence data. That's a bit of an older study from 2014. And there we looked at the distribution of butterfly species in Great Britain. And how we can combine information from different monitoring schemes to learn about trends in the occurrence of these species, and in particular also spatial variation in these trends. And the data situation here is that for butterflies in Great Britain, we have two main data sources. So one is the butterfly address project that collects so-called opportunistic presence records. So there's a huge number of volunteers or like citizen scientists that just occasionally go out into the landscape and just record all the butterfly species they see, say, during a Sunday hike or on any other occasion. So it doesn't follow any particular sampling protocol, but it generates a very huge data set where in the time we analyzed from 1991 to 2004, there were about 500,000 of these species lists that people recorded and sent in. And these records have quite some spatial variation in their spatial coverage, but they have like overall a very large spatial extent. And so we get these records from all over Britain, although like there are some hotspots, mostly in more densely habitated areas. And then the second data set is a UK butterfly monitoring scheme, which is a system of monitoring sites, where since the 70s, for most of them, some of them were established later, on transects of about 1 kilometer. In each week during the flight season of these butterflies, there are counts conducted to a standardized protocol. So these transects are walked, and all the butterflies occurring are counted, and this is repeated and basically each week. So it's a high quality data set on the variation of local abundance on these transects. And so we basically have this situation of one data set with a rather low data quality but a large spatial coverage, and the second data set with very high quality data and very informative about changes in abundance, but on a very local scale and with less spatial coverage. And here our idea was to find a way to combine the information from both data sets to get a better idea about changes in abundance of these species across the entire of Great Britain. And the main concept for the study, that was also reviewed in a quite recent paper with Nick Isaacs, so this should be 2019, not 14, sorry. So where we wrote a review paper about different general approaches to integrate different kinds of occurrence data for understanding species distribution. So the main idea is that in the end we should be able to link these different data types to the same ecological state variable, which is the actual or true population density in a cell on a spatial grid. And in particular that these pure presence absence data from this actors project should also be informative about changes in abundance, because quite generally we can assume that for different population densities there are also different chances to record the species in such a occurrence record, and therefore the frequency of occurrence records we get for certain species from a certain area should also inform us about abundance or population density. But of course, we don't know this relationship, so we can't analyze this occurrence data with respect to abundance because we don't know this relationship. But maybe we would be able to learn about this relationship by combining the two data sets. And that's what we did in a hierarchical statistical model. So where we had our common unknown state variable, which is the population density in each cell of the grid across Great Britain, and in all the years from 1995 to 2000, it was 1991 to 2005. And then we formulate the so-called observation models, so basically probability models that describe both the likelihood of count data in a certain area and the likelihood of these detection, non-detection data conditional on this common state variable. Again, for our count data, and taking account of overdispersion, which, for example, arises from the fact that these transects only cover a small part of a grid cell, so the actual abundance on the area covered by a transect might be different from the average population density in the area, of course. So to describe this variation, and then for relating the proportion of detections in the atlas data to population density, we had to parameterize this functional relationship between population density and detectability. Then when we looked at the results, in this case, we were in the end not so much interested in our posterior distribution for the parameters, but more on the model bit predictions, basically for this latent state variable that describes the population density in different grid cells at different times. And they are depicted here for two different years, 1990 and 2000. First, in terms of incidence or occurrence, so the probability that population densities are larger than 0. Then as the estimated population density themselves, and also as the posterior variance of this population density on a log scale as a measure of uncertainty in these in population densities. And if you, for example, compare these maps showing the uncertainty about population densities, and compare this to the amounts of records we got from this atlas data, and we can just see quite a nice link that for those areas where we got many records in the atlas data, and we get more precise estimates of population abundance or population densities than for these less intensively surveyed areas. And from there we then could also move on to look at spatial variation in the change across years and in trends in butterfly abundance across Great Britain. And get a more comprehensive picture of this changes than we could have gotten from either the atlas data or these transact monitoring data on its own. Because by combining these data, we could make use both of the direct link of the transact monitoring scheme to abundance and the large coverage of the adlibs and of the records from the Atlas project. And the key here was to also use the data to learn about this relationship between population density and the chance that a species shows up in these opportunistic occurrence records. Okay. So that were the two examples I wanted to show you, and of course I was happy to take questions on these examples. As I said, it didn't go not into too much technical detail here, but if you have any questions, we can of course discuss it and maybe also have a look at the model.
First of all, thank you very much. I'd love to be able to hand you a bouquet of flowers, as is customary with speakers, but we're not geographically close, so the best thing I can do is this party icon on Zoom. Thank you very much for this input talk. This gave me a much better understanding, and I think I speak for all here, in how we can go about engineering our own models, which is something that the Statistical Rethinking book has hyped up quite a bit, but I feel as though you've delivered on it much more than the book has so far. And while I have the floor, I'd actually like to pick your brain here. You just talked about associated uncertainty with the predictions, and a sort of pet project of mine so far over the past 2 years has been to link climate data, which went into this project and the last one that you presented, with associated uncertainty of the actual climate records, which is something climate scientists have apparently used for a long time, just us biologists have never used it. And I was wondering how you would go about trying to inform the model additionally with the mean expectation of climate, but also the uncertainty surrounding that mean.
I mean, if you have information about the uncertainty in your climate data, which I guess you would use as like some explanatory variable for your model, right?
Yes.
And then the most direct approach to do this, I would basically follow this idea of representing error in your explanatory variables. So that would mean in your model you have such a latent variable that describes the true value of annual mean temperature at a certain site. Then you formulate a probability model saying this true value comes from a normal distribution with a certain mean and variance according to what you know about the expected value and the uncertainty of this.
Yes, so I could take the, if we're talking climate reanalysis data sets, for example, which come with the mean expectation of the climate and then the standard deviation of the climate, I could just take basically build a prior here with a normal distribution, with the mean being the mean that's predicted by the climate reanalysis, and the standard deviation just being the standard deviation from the climate reanalysis.
Exactly, yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much.
I mean, this, of course, blows up your model quite a bit, because you now get, if you do this for multiple climate variables and in a large spatial data set, you get a lot of additional model parameters. But that's, so that would be the straightforward way to do this. I mean, there has been, so now then there are discussions about whether we should care more about the uncertainty in our explanatory explanatory variables. And I would say it depends. I mean, you can of course also take the more pragmatic approach and say, okay, if I in my model like describe this over dispersion, this is an additional unexplained variance. I could also say that part of this is just due to a misrepresentation in my explanatory variables. So one reason why I going back to the first example, like at a site with a certain vegetation cover, don't find the number of lizards I would expect. Could also be that there's an error in my vegetation data.
Right, of course.
So just lump it all up in the general model error term. So I guess which approach you take might depend on, of course, how much understanding you have about the uncertainty in your explanatory variables, which often we don't have. And then you also if you have any idea how specifically this uncertainty might affect your statistical inference.
Right. Cool. You answered my question so well. This has been fantastic. I know how to go about my next few models then. Thank you very much.
Could I ask another question? I stumbled across an R package that was published last year. It's called Embarcadero, and apparently it's about species distribution modeling with Bayesian additive regression trees. Have you heard about this or any experience how good it might be?
Yeah, no, I haven't heard about it, so I can't say much about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have any recommendations on what to start with when going into species distribution modeling but working with R? And then doing it the Bayesian way?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it depends a bit, like where you, like what you're aiming at, what your focus is. I mean, so with Eric, before we talked about this, and this package by also Overscan. Eric, help me what's the name of the
HMSC.
HMSC. So that applies like hierarchical models and different problems in modeling species distributions with a specific focus on modeling the joint distribution of species or community data. Yeah, so that might be something to look into. I discussed that with Eric. That's also something I have to explore more myself.
Okay.
I've just dropped a link to it in the chat if you want to follow up with it.
Okay.
Yeah, I will check
And
this out. Thank you.
if you ever want to talk about that, I'm getting to grips with that myself right now. And that goes for everyone in here. I'm always happy to talk about this package because I still don't fully understand it myself.
Perfect. Okay. Thanks. It's a good recommendation. Yeah.
Hello. In the butterfly example, did you take any spatial correlation into account? Like, did you use like Gaussian buses or something? Because I assume if there's a place that has like very low population, but next to it there's a large population, like sufficiently far away, then people could drive out and count or whatever. So are you taking into account these funny correlations in the geographical regions?
Yeah. So in this last example, in the study on butterfly abundance, so we have this and this latent variable in our model that describes the population density in each grid cell. And then we have a number of so-called hyperparameters that describe the spatial and temporal variation in this in population density, and that includes spatial effects or spatial correlation. Yeah, so we assume that there's spatial correlation in the population density.
You might have answered. Maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I'm more like, if you have one data point, like one of your Y's that is close to another Y, are there any pooling between those?
Yeah, so I mean, we do not directly model the spatial autocorrelation between these observations, but we link them to this like underlying state variable, and for which we formulate a spatial model.
Okay, perfect. One thing, I really love your way of drawing hierarchical models. It's fairly intuitive. Like, it took me some time to understand it, but it's a very good way of showing it. You also have the huge advantage of all of your parameters actually mean something because it's real things.
Maybe a more naive and philosophical question. So these butterfly thing, how to create about detectability if you don't know if the species is there or not, you don't have data. Would this approach of Bayesian hierarchical models also help like these people working with, for example, these large apps like iNaturalist and stuff like this, where you just have like data collected by non-scientists taking pictures, and then you have problems in using this data because it's not sampled in a nice way, in an ordered way. It's like your data, the butterfly, and people are having problems using this data to make some ecological improvement and meaning out of it.
Yeah, and that's also
this can be applied there.
Yeah, I mean, that's also there's also like a big motivation for the development of these methods, that we now get this like big amount of citizen science-based and presence-only data, like the ones you mentioned, or GBIF also, and they also discussed quite a bit in this review paper by Nick Isaac, again from 2019, not 14. Typo here. Yeah, I mean, there are a few, or like an additional challenge from this like real presence only data is that we don't have any information on how often people went to certain areas, and we don't have any estimate of no like direct estimate of the sampling effort. So in these atlas, in the atlas project, since people are asked to send in species lists, and whenever we get a list that does not contain our focus species, we can count this as an absence record. So we can most reasonably assume that if this person had encountered this species, it would appear on the list.
Yeah, I see the point. I see. I also see my own mistake in there. I'm never taking pictures of Bellis per Ennis. It's like, know this already.
I mean, there are ways to relax this assumption, and for example, people are also using, for example, the length of the species list as a proxy for sampling effort. So if like someone is, so if you get a species list with 20 species, but like your focus species is missing, then you take this as a stronger sign of absence than a species list that only records 2 species. And so forth. And then, of course, you can also you can include more predictors of sampling efforts. So, and there are also studies that use like distance to roads or distance to cities as a predictor of sampling effort, and then try to not only include a model of space variation in the population and density, but also a spatial model of variation in sampling effort. There you have always, and it becomes kind of an art to like understand and whether and from a certain data set you can really tear apart this and different effects of spatial variation in abundance and spatial variation in sampling effort to come up with a good estimate of spatial variation in the true abundance of species.
That's a pity. I thought now it's going to be super easy to take like iNaturalist and publish the next 20 years only in Nature.
Yeah, I mean you probably can get some idea by combining records and by combining records across different species and taking the recording of different species as an index for the sampling effort in a certain area. But it becomes a bit tricky. And then, of course, depending on the species, you might also have problems with misidentification, which we also didn't account for in this study. So, here for the common butterfly species we looked at, we assume that there are no false positives. So and we reported the presence of the species, we assumed that this was correctly identified. I mean, there was also some data cleaning done before to remove like very improbable records. But beyond that, in this analysis, we didn't account for the possibility that the species was recorded, although it's not there.
Yeah, I think these false positives are becoming a problem if it's a rare species. If it's a really abundant one, having like plus minus 10 false positives in there in a really common species doesn't matter a lot. But if it's like rare one, then it's getting really problematic, I think.
Yeah.
It's a good point.
If I may weigh in on that with false positives, especially through citizen science, there's been, I keep circling back to the guy, but Otso Ovaskainen has started up a project with the Matthiopolis group in Glasgow about going through citizen science data sets and trying to identify programmatically false positives. It's a really new project, which is really just begun work. But if you're interested, especially Bernd, if you're interested in identifying false positives from data sets like these, you might want to keep an eye out for those.
Can you write the names in the chat?
Sure thing. Eric? Yeah, I'll pop them down there.
Cool, thanks.
I have one question. I'm 90% sure.
Okay, I'm afraid there's again like an audio problem. Can't really hear you.
In your butterfly model, right? That was the same for both the present absence volunteer data and for the real one, right? So in the
I'm sorry.
the counts.
I can't understand you
and
due
in
to
the,
some audio problems.
Never mind.
Jan, sorry, if you could type your question out because you're a robot right now, that
Yeah.
would be very helpful.
I will.
Yes.
I'm not going to ask a question. I just want to say a massive thank you. I'm one of the people that cannot really offer too much insight with questions. But when I came to this talk, my idea of hierarchical models was something like I would never understand, but this has been a really informative talk on how you've gone from simple models to more structured and complex. And it's been very, very clear. So I just want to say thank you.
Yeah, thank you. No, it was really a pleasure to have an opportunity these days to share like some ideas in a different group.
Yeah.
So just to bridge the time until the question from Jan arrives, maybe a question not towards Jörn, but towards Sam, to maybe get the two of you talking a bit. Sam, you work a lot with demographic models. Do you think any of the hierarchical models presented here have jogged your brain a bit?
Yeah, because right now I'm starting to get a lot more into IPM, so integral projection models, and the underlying stuff for them are all regression. So it's all regression work. And what I was thinking with this is something I've been asking a lot of people who are teaching me about the IPM stuff is how far can we push this envelope? How far can we involve, say, parameters other than body size or other than growth rate? Can we use behaviors and different cool things like that that people don't often use in demographic models? And what I was thinking with this is you can actually create allocation hierarchies and involve those, whether that be from basal resources to different body size and then secondary sexual traits, and then you've got behaviors that you can create an allocation tree. So I thought this would be a really cool thing to nest within some population framework. I don't know much about the IPM stuff. I'm just talking to people that know about it, but it seems like a cool approach.
Yeah, I mean the key, the key of this, like IPM approach, which I know again mostly from Macari and colleagues, is to basically combine the two things I spoke about here. So and try to learn about population dynamics from combining measurements, so more like direct measurements of demographic rates, and with measurements on and data on abundance intercurrence, so the outcome of the demographic processes.
Yeah,
and that's quite promising, and that's also something we are like looking for with this, like with our Podaceae species. So here we have, and so what I showed, we have used the demographic data to come up with models of population dynamics that are independent from the occurrence records, and so that we can compare the predictions and based on demography to species distribution data and understand the mismatch. Like another avenue would be to estimate models of species range dynamics, and where we combine information like modest and direct information on variation of demographic rates across environmental gradients, and with data on the species distribution, so the outcome of the process. So try to understand leadership dynamics from both ends at the same time, if you want. But that, of course, means that within your statistical model, you run and then need a representation of spatial population dynamics.
Yeah.
Very huge state space, and that still is a bit of a challenge.
But it's interesting how you can nest all of those within a specific framework.
All right, that sounds like Sam has a lot to ponder now. Shall we move over to Jan's question from the chat? And Jan, I hope you can hear us well. Otherwise, the answer will be in the recording if you have connection issues.
Okay, so the question is about the meaning of this lambda parameter in the butterfly example. And so to clarify this, so this value lambda again for each good cell and year, so that represents the true population density at this point in space and time, which of course we don't know, but we want to estimate. And we link this to both data type and for the counted data from the monitoring transects. And the idea is that there's like average population density is a predictor of the population density and the expected count on such a monitoring transect. Again, taking into account that there's some overdispersion going on, and then for the detection, non-detection data, the key is this estimated relationship between this population density. So that would basically be the state variable lambda and the probability that like a random recorder going to this area and would detect the presence of the species. And so this is close to zero if population densities are very small, and then increases if population densities go up, but then apparently it again levels off. I hope that gives a better idea of the interpretation of this.
Yeah, thanks.
Population density state variable and how it is linked to presence absence records.
Oh, yeah, that sounded like that did it explanation wise. Are there any more questions from the audience?
I don't have a question, but I really want to thank you for the input talk. It really opens my eyes to some of the applications of this hierarchical model. I've also been working with the package HMSC, but because of my data type is more of presence only, like this butterfly example that you gave, it really opens my eyes to see some of the applications that are possible within the research focus for me. Thank you.
Yes, and I think those were very, very good closing words. Jörn, from my side, thank you so much for sacrificing 2 hours of your Friday here. I like to believe that this sacrifice was not in vain. I really think we all benefited a lot from it. Thank you so much. This has been tremendous.
Yeah, great. It was a pleasure. And even had to build on better.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Everyone, have a good weekend. Jörn, if you would not mind sending us the bugs code so that Jan can get started on the negative binomial. Mm-hmm. That would be great, and I'll share the link to the recording with you afterwards.
Okay, cool.
Cool. Thank you so much again, and have a good weekend, guys.
Thank you. See you guys.
Goodbye.
Bye.